As I've said many times on this channel, I've always been intrigued by the aesthetic and plot lines of the horror genre, but I've never been able to explore the genre because, to put it lightly, I frighten easily. At least, I used to. It turns out that being in the midst of an actual f***ing plague really makes one reevaluate what is and is not scary. So I went about trying to ease some of that quarantine stress the only way I know how. Yeah, that's what you get for not wearing a mask, asshole! But while rampaging my way through a virus personified, I remembered that there's a classic that I've neglected since I was a child. Resident Evil 4. Holy shit, that was f***ing awesome! I guess it's okay. At least good enough to convince me to work my way through the series in my spare time. So far I've played a bit of Remake, Resident Evil 4, and a full co-op playthrough of Resident Evil 5, and I consider myself a new fan. But while researching the series and its roots, I discovered that it goes back even further than people may realize. Resident Evil didn't start as an original concept, but as a remake of a Famicom horror RPG called Sweet Home, which was a tie-in game to a 1989 film of the same name. When Capcom couldn't reacquire the license, they shifted the development and effectively mutated the would-be remake into its own creation. This means that Sweet Home never got an official overseas release, for obvious bloody reasons, despite how well received it was in Japan. Thankfully, in the year 2000, it was treated to a serviceable, if unpolished, fan translation by Gaijin Productions and Suicidal Translations. This has sort of become the de facto translation for people wanting to play the game in English, and it's also the one I used for this playthrough. The story follows a documentary film crew as they scour the dilapidated remains of a mansion once owned by a famous artist, in hopes of preserving his many lost works. But as they enter, a tortured spirit causes a cave-in that traps them inside. The remainder of the game is spent trying to make your escape while uncovering the gruesome history of the mansion and its inhabitants. And that's all I'm going to tell you, because piecing the story together yourself through old journals and frescoes scattered throughout the mansion is an integral part of the experience. Of course, doing so is far easier said than done. The mansion is full of obstructions, and the possibility of permadeath is always right around the corner, whether it be from the crumbling infrastructure, deadly creatures, or intentional booby traps peppered throughout the mansion. This allows for an impressive level of interactivity, which is something I've always been a fan of in RPGs, just something that breaks up the monotony of simply traveling from one monster encounter to the next, and Sweet Home is one of the best examples I've seen of this. Each character has their own special item to help them traverse the mansion safely. A lighter to burn through Shimenawa, a vacuum to clean up debris, a key that opens up many, but not all, the house's doors, a medkit to help recover from status ailments, and a camera to preserve the frescoes, thereby revealing both hints and fragments of the story to the player. These items are essential, but a character death doesn't make the game unwinnable, as replacements for their specialty items are scattered throughout the mansion and can be used by any party member. However, the loss of a character is still a devastating blow because it strains your already limited inventory further and affects your combat prowess. Switching out party members and managing the limited inventory space for key items becomes a focal point of successfully navigating the mansion and its obstacles. You may often find yourself faced with a problem that can only be solved with a specific item, one which may or may not be held by your current characters. This often forces you to trek back and forth between rooms to make adjustments, whether to your party or your inventory, before you can progress. You may have 5 characters, but they can only be formed in groups of 3. This leads to a lot of menu navigation, which can easily become monotonous for some players, but there's really no better solution given the limited number of buttons on an NES controller. Besides, most RPGs of the era used a similarly bloated interface, but didn't have nearly as many actions to account for, so I can give Sweet Home a pass on this. I did feel it necessary to mention it anyway, as it's the only place where Sweet Home truly shows its age. As you may have guessed, there's a lot of find item A to use at location B puzzles in Sweet Home, but there's also a surprising amount of progression that relies more on player agency and creative expression. You could search the mansion for an item to make ice traversal easier, or you can skillfully maneuver your characters one at a time. These bramble patches cause you damage as you walk on them unless you have a specific item to help, but your inventory space is limited, so you may think it's a better plan to simply take the damage instead of making a whole nother trek back through the mansion all over again to find said item. While playing Sweet Home, I felt that the devs struck a good balance between the number of scenarios with predetermined solutions versus the ones that allowed for more freeform creative problem solving, and this led to several cathartic eureka moments. This, to me, is Sweet Home's most impressive feature. It keeps the player moving forward at a quick pace while also letting them feel like they're solving the mansion's riddles on their own. The reason this is all possible is because of how well Sweet Home telegraphs its puzzles and possible solutions. There is surprisingly no NES logic here. everything makes sense. Often I would only be left in the dark as to where to go or what to do next for a short moment before I'd stumble upon the solution. And whenever I did become temporarily stumped, a hint was only a few rooms away, hidden in a note or on one of the frescoes. And when all else failed, sometimes I just needed to pray for answers. Although the game was overall very clear in its direction and intentions, there were unfortunately a few instances where this wasn't the case. Early on, you were tasked with finding a spear as a part of a puzzle solution, which should be easy enough to find given the fact that I'd passed several on my way to this room. I even had some equipped as weapons. But it isn't these spears the game wants. Instead, it wants a very specific key item spear that can't be used as a weapon. Unfortunately, this was not a one-time issue. Apparently, the myriad of axes I found are strong enough to slash through flesh and bone, but not strong enough to cut through some logs. And these specific candles have a purpose other than lighting your path, which is all that the other candles were good for before this section of the game. This caused me to assume they were unimportant, and I had to backtrack for them later. In a game with so few item types, I don't know why they couldn't have drawn a couple extra sprites to cut down on confusion, or even just name them differently. Change one set of candles into lanterns, or make the wood cutting axe a saw so you can more easily differentiate weapons from tools. But this was just a minor stumbling block in an overall brilliant exploratory experience. What really put a halt to my progression were the traps. And I mean that literally, by the way. In-game, they halted my character's progression. Because as a player, I really enjoyed the way they enhanced the experience. They required the player to think and react quickly. Every second wasted is a chance to take more damage or outright die depending on the severity of the situation. The first time a party member fell from a broken wood panel, I was freaking out, fumbling with the menu until I finally figured out how to save them. And it was at that very moment I realized I was playing something special. I'm guessing there will be some players who will misconstrue these scenarios as unfair because the solution is not immediately apparent, but I can assure you there's always a way out of some kind. Now, whether your party is currently equipped with the right tools to escape said situation is a different story. But even if you do find yourself in a seemingly unsurvivable predicament, the game lets you save at any time, so all it takes is a reload to get you back on your feet. This also effectively lets you choose your own difficulty. If you want an easy stroll through a haunted mansion just to take in the scenery and enjoy the puzzles, then save often. But if you enjoy a more harrowing experience, you can always limit your saves to each time you enter a new area. Speaking of, there are 12 such areas, and though limited in size, the game never feels lacking in variety. The sections of the mansion are eclectic enough to give them each their own unique identity, while still connecting back to each other in a very natural-feeling way. The many rooms and corridors give the mansion a sense of scale that is impressive considering that your exploration is relegated to the titular home and the surrounding landscape. It's really rare to see an RPG that's not a dungeon crawler focus entirely on a single building. In fact, the only other example that comes to my mind is Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter, but its successful implementation in Sweet Home really makes me question why. I've always believed that limitations breed creativity, and this mantra is simply oozing from Sweet Home's every disgusting, pulsing boil. Ugh! Not just in its level design, but also in its presentation. Sweet Home almost looks more like a modern-day retro throwback than a Famicom classic. One needs only glance at these monster designs and animations to see how impressive they are. Less appreciated, but equally important, are the little details like the scampering mice and the gouges in the walls, which all work to make the world feel plausible despite the hardware limitations and supernatural happenings. Many critics wrap up the section of the game's presentation by calling it atmospheric. And for a lack of a better term, I would have to agree. But while the horror trappings are a huge selling point for many, for me they're just a bonus. The real beauty of Sweet Home lies in its unique and engaging gameplay. So let's continue discussing that. The RPG side of Sweet Home shows through most clearly in its combat and leveling systems, but they're still given enough of a spin to feel unique. The game's equivalent of special attacks come in the form of tools. The same tools you've been finding throughout the mansion have uses both outside and inside of battle. This lends the game a touch of believability and, for a lack of a better word, realism. Of course, that realistic bent works both ways. Many tools won't be practical in a fight, but you'd be surprised what could end up being useful in a pinch. My favorite combat mechanic is the ability to call for help. If you take a turn to use the call command, you get a limited amount of time to manually move your other characters one by one to the battle's destination. And if you succeed, you get to fight with up to all 5 characters at once. While I didn't make much use of this feature, I was incredibly excited to encounter it, as I don't think I've ever seen it done in a game since. And last but not least, you can break out some good old spiritual warfare with the pray command. Choosing to pray in battle activates a timing minigame that makes your attacks pack a much larger punch at the cost of prey points, this game's version of magic points. But these points are a limited resource, which means they need to be managed carefully. Options to restore them are few and far between. I really love the way the combat commands are framed to fit the setting, but I must admit they're better in theory than in practice. Most battles will still just have you spamming the standard attack command, but most importantly, the combat manages to remain tense despite its lack of complexity. Not only do enemies hit hard, but almost every monster in the game has a chance to inflict a status ailment, all of which have lingering effects after battle. These effects hinder your exploration and in a lot of cases continue to drain your character's HP or prey points, at least until you do something to remedy it. The tension is bolstered by the brilliant difficulty curve. In any given area of the mansion, I'd routinely level up just enough through natural play that my parties could easily take down the enemies that lurked there, only to have my confidence shattered when I'd enter a new room and take the first devastating attack from a new batch of grotesque creatures. Because tonics, this game's sole healing item, are limited and death is always a possibility, I often found myself fleeing instead of fighting. Thankfully, running isn't just a viable option, but an expected one. I'd estimate that I ran from 1 out of every 5 battles to try and conserve my HP and tonics, which for an RPG is an incredibly high ratio, but I was still more than strong enough to beat the final boss by the time I got to the end without any real grinding. As a player, I'm often most impressed by games that manage to make all their separate ideas and gameplay systems mesh into a compelling whole without feeling too bloated or over-designed. And Sweet Home absolutely nails it. This is even more impressive when you consider that not only was it Capcom's first crack at an RPG, but also the pioneer of the entire survival horror genre. Generally, big firsts in gaming are followed by a giant asterisk about how the game was important for its historical value, but not necessarily still worth playing. But I'm here to tell you that it absolutely is. I went into Sweet Home with tempered expectations, hoping it would be enjoyable within the limitations of the NES, but it got its hooks in me and didn't let go. That's not hyperbole. I actually finished the game in a single 9-hour session because of how thoroughly it sucked me in. Sweet Home is more unique, well-designed, and memorable than the majority of RPGs that have been released since, despite the genre having had 30 years to evolve and implement lessons learned from it. And whether I was solving a puzzle, fighting for my life, or piecing together the mysteries of the mansion, there was never a dull moment. Hello everyone, thanks so much for watching. I know it's been a while. This year has been an ordeal for everyone. And with that in mind, I'd like to give a specialized thank you to my patrons, both past and present, whom have helped to make this channel's content and my life in general a bit easier. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank Caffeine, which isn't a coffee joke, that's the name of the patron, Constantine Graff, Cyrus Drager, Gabe Nunez, Giant Wang Jared, Green Poolball, West Morgan, and Zet and Pelly Gaming. If I pronounced anyone's name wrong, please feel free to let me know in the comments, or through Patreon. And if the rest of you would like to help as well, you can always donate to my Patreon, or if you want help for free, you can always like, comment, and share this video. It always really helps. Happy Halloween, stay safe, and enjoy.